So we're continuing today's theme of spatial structure in language, how language structures spatial conception, which is, again, part of one of the major schematic systems, configurational structure. But in this case, it's all going to be about this enormous, extensive, elaborate system that language has for representing non-veridical things that don't really happen as such. For the moment, we can think of it as a form of metaphor, but that can be refined. In particular, the main type will be representing, using motion to represent non-motion, to represent stationary stuff. And to start off with some examples, just to illustrate how the system works, some linguistic examples. This fence goes from the plateau down into the valley. So here's a plateau, here's a valley, and there's a fence statically on the line there, standing there. But instead of referring to the fence as stationary, which is the way we know that it is, the language actually uses words that basically refer to motion. Namely, the fence goes, so it's a motion verb, from the plateau down into the valley. So it's an example of fictive motion. It's what I call fictive motion. The cliff wall faces towards the valley, away from the valley. So here's a cliff. Here's the cliff wall, like a rock, a big rock promontory. And here's some flat land, and here's a valley. And you could say, like, the cliff wall faces towards the valley, or if the valley were over here, the cliff wall faces away from the valley. So, like, it's as if there's something coming out of the cliff wall that's emanating from it that we can describe linguistically as if there were actual motion there. So we're using motion preposition like towards, away from, and so forth, into. And yet nothing is moving. I looked out past the steeple. So steeple is like a church tower. I looked out past the steeple, means my line of sight is imagined is going this way. Out past the steeple. Again, nothing's moving, but it's phrased as if it were. The vacuum cleaner is down around behind the clothes hamper. Well, here, this is perfect English, but it must be hard for any other language. So here's a clothes hamper where you put dirty clothes. Here's the vacuum cleaner, and it means that the vacuum cleaner is down around behind the clothes hamper. It's sort of telling you where it is. The scenery rushed past us. We're driving along, and you can see the scenery rushed past us. Even the scenery is stationary. So these are all examples of fictive motion. And we'll be going over them systematically according to the types. Well, in addition, what I want to do is, it seems to me that everything that language is here doing, there are parallels in visual perception, and probably other aspects of perception, but just to take visual perception. And so I want to frame the theory. One of the mainstays of my approach is to see what language does structurally as either similar to or different from what other cognitive systems also do. In fact, the seventh talk will be precisely about that. It's what I call the overlapping systems model cognitive organization. And it tries to look at different cognitive systems for how they're structured, what their structure is. Once we're in a position to say, well, this is what linguistic structure is like, then you can compare it to the structure in visual perception, in motor control, in affect, feeling, and so forth, and see what kinds of structural overlaps there are. So throughout, one thing, I'm certainly not a perception psychologist, but I talked to them, and so one thing I did while working on this topic was keep an eye out for possible visual parallels or disparallels, on the grounds that there might be something more basic yet going on in cognition, of which the linguistic phenomena is just one reflection. So that's taking a broader stance. So there are various kinds of visual parallels, some of which have been worked on extensively in psychology, and others which one could propose to be worked on. So, for example, there's such things as what are traditionally called apparent motion in psychology, which is also known as, could be, for example, the Marquis effect. When you see a row of lights, and the light one goes on after another, and in fact you see a line of motion of light going along. That's called the apparent motion effect. And then there's something called induced motion, where you have in a dark room you see a lighted frame and a rod. If you tilt the frame, some people see a rod tilted. So it's called induced motion. So these are, in the first case, there's no motion at all. You perceive motion. Here there is some motion, but you misperceive what the thing is that's moving. There's also, according to Michael Layton's theory of perception, if you see a curved line of any sort, you experience it in terms of a smooth line that has gotten protuberances or indentations in it. So let me stop there, but the idea is that there may be parallels in visual perception that either misplace motion or involve the perception of motion where none is taking place, and so forth. And I'll be looking for, in this taxonomy, in this analysis, the parallels that might take place across the two cognitive systems. So first, let me have that kind of an introduction. Let me say what I think general fictivity is all about. It's not just motion; it's a general process, and in it, this kind of fictivity always takes place within the psyche of a single individual. It's not a group phenomenon. It has to happen inside a single individual. And it seems that what underlies it in both visual cases and in linguistic cases is that there are two distinct subsystems, cognitive subsystems, each of which bears a representation of the same thing. So these are two different representations. They can be felt to be in conflict, or they can be felt to be complementary, but they're distinct representations of otherwise the same thing. So those are two different parts of cognition. In addition, there's a third part, which assesses these two. It assesses it that one of these representations is more veridical, that is true or faithful to reality, and the other one is less veridical. So that's that kind of cognitive setup. Those three factors seems to be what's at work whenever you have a fictive effect. And the way they work out in language is that what is factive, these two representations, I named them. One which is treated as more veridical, I call factive, from the word fact, and one which is regarded as or assessed as less veridical, I call fictive. And these are actual words in English, but I deliberately choose a word like fictive instead of, let's say, fictitious, because fictitious means it's really non-existent. And I want to avoid any issues in philosophy of actual claims of something being out there or not being out there. And I want to reserve the whole realm of discourse to cognitive experience and cognitive processing, regardless of whether something is actually out there. So that's why I appeal to a third cognitive system that assesses this one as more fictive, this one as more factive. So in a sentence like the fence goes from the plateau down to the valley, what's fact about it is nothing linguistic. It's, on the contrary, some part of your cognition which has general knowledge about fences and the real world and knows for a fact that fences are stationary and it's just standing there. However, what is feeding the fictive portion of the cognition in this case is the actual word. It's the word sentence goes ahead and uses words like go and from and into and down and so forth, which are basically motion specifying words. So you've got two distinct representations, and some other part of your mind assesses one of them as fictive, namely the literal meaning of the wording, and something else is factive, namely your common knowledge, basic world understanding of fact. Something comparable but different might be taking place in the realm of visual perception, although I'd like to set it up in a parallel way. Let's say that you see a Pac-Man shape, which is like that. Well, factively, you'll see this kind of shape, statically as such. Fictively, you might sense a kind of history, as if there were once a full circle, and later, from that circle, a pie wedge-shaped portion was removed, leaving the result shape. So some portion of your perception might sense that kind of sequence of events. And in fact, I use, as technical terms, I use the distinction between the word see and the word sense. So seeing is the palpable, tangible, concrete figure that you see, which is this static shape. And some third portion of your cognition assesses that as more of a vertical. And some other part of your cognition, at the same time, has a different representation for the same thing, one which is sequential in character, first a circle, then a pie wedge removed. And this is sensed at a less palpable, less tangible, more abstract level. And that's what I would say that this third part of you would assess as less vertical. And therefore, and I'm going to use the words factive for this and fictive for that, in order to use the same terminology for the same two circumstances. In general, I mean, the fictivity is quite a general phenomenon, and you're going to have, the one I'm going to mainly demonstrate today is what will be called fictive motion. So that something which factively is assessed as stationary is nevertheless somehow represented either in some visual sensing manner or in the literal wording of the sentence as moving. So that's fictive motion. But you can have fictive almost anything. You can have fictive stationariness, where, for example, the wording suggests stationariness, but in fact, the actual stuff is moving. You can have fictive change, fictive stasis, fictive cause. There's all sorts of fictive phenomena going on. But this time I'll mainly do fictive motion. And in illustrating fictive motion languages, you can ask the question, well, what is universal about fictive motion, and what is language specific about it? Well, what we find, if you look around various languages, not every language will have fictive motion in the same place. For example, where English can say, the sun shone into the cave with fictive motion, Spanish would not be able to say that. They would say something factively, something like, the sun illuminated the cave, or illuminated the interior of the cave. So a non-factive representation. So not every language has fictivity in the same places. But probably every language has some forms of fictivity, fictive motion. And what's universal is that when it has fictive motion, it's always in the same direction. It'll be common across languages, how the fictive motion is represented as moving, as taking place. That's the universality thing, and I will propose a principle that governs, that determines what this direction of motion is. Then there's the issue of the phenomenology of it, what is actually experienced. And people, first of all, individuals seem to differ, and also the examples seem to differ. They range from the merest sense of some directedness to a compelling sense that something must be moving. I mean, all these fictive motion examples, they range in that way. Different individuals differ in how strongly they feel it. Examples differ in how strongly they seem to induce this feeling. And also, phenomenologically, there seem to be differences as to what is felt to, in fact, move. So if you say the fence went from the plateau down into the valley, the language literally has the fences moving. But you don't have to necessarily think the fence is moving that way. You might think of your focus of attention as moving along the fence, or something else as some motorcycle moving alongside the fence while doing it, or some abstracted directedness inherent in the fence, or some very abstract sense of motion. The fictive motion is represented as moving, as taking place. That's the universality thing, and I will propose a principle that governs, that determines what this direction of motion is. Then there's the issue of the phenomenology of it, what is actually experienced. And people, first of all, individuals seem to differ, and also the examples seem to differ. They range from the merest sense of some directedness to a compelling sense that something must be moving. I mean, all these fictive motion examples, they range in that way. Different individuals differ in how strongly they feel it. Examples differ in how strongly they seem to induce this feeling. And also, phenomenologically, there seem to be differences as to what is felt to, in fact, move. So if you say the fence went from the plateau down into the valley, the language literally has the fences moving. But you don't have to necessarily think the fence is moving that way. You might think of your focus of attention as moving along the fence, or something else as some motorcycle moving alongside the fence while doing it, or some abstracted directedness inherent in the fence, or some very abstract sense of motion. It's not clear what you think is moving, but if you have a strong enough feeling of motion, you'll feel that something is moving. So that's the phenomenology. So it's emanation. Oh, yeah. So there are going to be many categories of fictive motion. There's quite a few. In the past, fictive motion was recognized, not with that term, but for a long time, linguists have noticed things like saying, this road runs from Chicago to New York, that kind of thing. That's long been noticed. And in fact, it's one of the types. I call it a coextension path. But since it's the most familiar type, I'm putting it last. And instead, we'll go to some other types which are essentially, or for the most part, unrecognized. So the first type I call emanation. It's the emanation category of fictive motion. And in emanation, something is experienced as, the fictive motion is depicted as if something is emerging from one object, moves in a straight line through space, and impinges on a distal object. That's basically the emanation type. And it has a number of subdivisions. So one of the subdivisions I call, orientation paths. And for this, the first object has to have a front. And so this fictive line emanates from the front. There are two kinds of fronts, a point front and a planar front. So with a point front, for example, you have sentences like, the arrow points towards the city, or into the city, or points past the city. Well, let's say you have a signpost with an arrow on it, and the arrow is not moving, the city is not moving, but it's as if, but nevertheless, English uses words like towards, past, away from, not around, I guess, but because it's got to be a straight line. But the idea seems to be that the arrow has a front, in fact, a point-like front, and it's as if some kind of fictive emanation, which you can't see, it's invisible, moves through space in a straight line. In fact, it's coaxial with the shaft of the arrow. So it's coaxial with it. And it's as if it moves along the path that the preposition tells you. So that if the preposition says towards, then it moves towards the city. If it says past, it moves past the city. So that's one kind of fictive motion with the orientation type. Another has a face type or planar front, like here's the cliff wall. And you can say the cliff wall faces towards the valley. Again, it's as if the plane, it acts like a face, as if some kind of intangible line emanates from it, perpendicular to the face, and its path is indicated by the preposition. So it goes into the valley, so fine. The cliff wall faces into the valley, past the valley, and so forth. So that's the orientation path type. Let's see where we are. Okay, the next type is radiation paths. It's also an emanation type. And it's also is the notion of some kind of radiation emanating from some source object and moving in a straight line and impinging on some distal object. So the sun is an example, and a good sentence is, light shown from the sun into the cave. So here's the sun. Here's light coming from the sun, moving into the cave. And it's expressed exactly that way. So light shown from the sun into the cave or onto the back wall of the cave. Every sentence involves motion. So, not everything, but the from does and the into does and so forth. These are basically motion prepositions. Now, what's interesting about this is one of the compelling ones, by the way. You can't convince anybody that perhaps nothing is moving from the sun into the cave. Now, true, we have scientists that now tell us photons are in fact moving from the sun into the cave, but nobody ever saw photons before. And so if our languages are saying something like shown from the sun into the cave, it's not because we know about photons. It's got to be for some other cognitive reason that direction is picked. Well, but the point is, and it's a very compelling direction. The point is, though, it doesn't have to be that way. If you have something intangible, you can't see any actual motion. If something intangible can move from point A to point B, something complementary and intangible could be conceptualized as moving from B to A. So you could imagine a scenario in which what the sun does is it sucks energy, it attracts energy. And so let's say, here's the sun, here's my hand. When there's a clear, straight path between the sun and my hand, the sun attracts energy out of my hand. When the energy leaves it, my hand glows. And when the energy hits the sun glows. And in fact, it is attracting energy from lots of different things, so the sun glows lots. There's nothing to fault that conceptualization. However, no language has it. No language would ever say this: the light shone from my hand onto the sun. Doesn't exist. The light shone from the sun onto my hand, fine, but not the other way. Similarly, you don't get the light emanating from some point in between us. So no language would say something like, the light shone onto the sun and my hand from a point between us. Doesn't exist. Also, part of this original conceptualization is that the radiation is moving. So no language represents the fact as if it were. So you never have something like the light hung between the sun and my hand, as if it were depicted as stationary. So all these possibilities don't exist. So only one out of the whole range of conceptualizations is ever allowed. In a little bit, I will offer a principle that explains why this is the case, that accounts for it. Okay, so that's an example of radiation paths. Still a subtype of emanation. The third type of emanation is I call shadow paths. So this is where, for example, you have a pole and a wall, let's say, and you've got a shadow of a pole on the wall. Well, the way you typically can say these things is you can say the shadow of the pole fell on the wall, so it's from there to there, fell on the wall or onto the wall. Or the shadow so the pole cast its shadow against the wall, or threw a shadow on the wall, or threw its shadow down into the valley. The shadow goes everywhere. But you've got with fictive motion. When in fact, in this total situation, nothing's moving. Yet, it's factively stationary. But fictively, insofar as in the way that it's described linguistically, the shadow is moving. In particular, it's always moving from the physical object to the silhouette. You never have a sentence like, the shadow jumped from the wall onto the pole. It's always this way. Again, well, the same principle will cover why that is. And the reason shadow paths is important is because while somebody might argue that with radiation paths there really are photons, and they really are moving in the way that they're depicted, no physicist claims that there exist particles called shadowons, which in fact move from the pole to the shadow. So it's a good antidote to that claim for radiation paths. A fourth type of emanation path is a sensory path. And this exists for both for all the sense organs. And first, let me consider the case where it's not agentive, where with a sensory path, there are two objects can be named. There's the experiencer and the experienced object. And this will be the proximal object, that's the distal object. So, as long as the experiencer is not acting agentively, it turns out that, at least English, permits the fictive motion to go in either direction. This is the first time we've seen the possibility that it could be expressed in either direction. For example, you could say, I can hear him all the way from where he's standing, so from him to me, or I can hear him all the way from where I'm standing, from me to him. Same with smell. I can smell him all the way from where he's standing. I can smell him all the way from where I'm standing. And I name these two directions in different ways. They seem to evoke different conceptualizations. But the first, it's as if the experiencer, it's a person, experiencer, emits a probe, some kind of probe goes along, till it encounters and senses some experienced object. That's the first conceptualization. The second one is that this experienced object emits a stimulus, which moves along and impinges on the experiencer, who then interprets it. It also happens visually, though sometimes you have to tweak it a bit so the passive turns out to work better. So you can say, we can be seen from where we can be seen by the enemy from where we're standing. So here we are. Here's the enemy. We can be seen by the enemy from where we are, or we can be seen by the enemy from where they are positioned. Now, in all of these particular examples, I've picked a verb, see or hear or smell, which is lexicalized to take the experiencer as subject. So I see, that's the experiencer. But often, given the fact that this non-agentive form of sensory path can go in both directions, fictively, you often find verbs lexicalized to take the experienced object as subject. So, for example, here's one. In English, it's show, one of the senses of show. So if this is a wall, and here's the old wallpaper on the wall, and over that you put a coating of paint. And you can say that the old wallpaper shows through the paint even to, and use the word to, even to a casual passerby. Or you could have had the C one, even a casual passerby can see the old wallpaper through the paint. But we have both directions again. However, if the experiencer is agented, acts agentively in emitting the probe, then it only goes in one way. It always goes from the experiencer to the experienced. So like in English, see is non-agentive, look is agentive. Same with hear versus listen. So look always goes from the experiencer out. And it can be fictive. So you can say, I looked, as one of my initial examples, I looked out past the steeple. But you can say, I looked into the valley, I looked past the valley, and so forth. And it's as if some, is the experiencer, some line of sight is moving axially along the line of sight, as if something intangible is moving axially along the line of sight in the direction shown. So you say, I looked into the valley, I looked past the valley, I looked away from the valley, and so forth. However, in this case, there is no reverse direction. You can't say, I looked out of the valley, out of the distant valley into my eyes. That kind of doesn't exist. Okay? And then one more wrinkle on this, and that is, although this isn't technically emanation, nevertheless, the axial motion of the line of sight, which I just described in terms of something intangible moving axially along it, but the line of sight as a line can actually move laterally and be so described in, or this is also laterally, let's say, and it can be so described in English words. So you can say, I slowly looked, I looked towards the door. Well, let's say that's the door. I slowly looked towards the door is what? I mean, it's this. So, towards, as a preposition, usually refers to like the ball rolled towards the door. It usually involves a gradually decreasing distance between the figure object and the ground object. But in this case, if you say I slowly turned, or slowly looked, or turned, either one, towards the door, nothing's moving close. All that's moving is my head. But it's rotating. It's not moving closer to the door. It's not decreasing the distance. But what is? This line of sight. The line of sight that comes out directly in front of me, as I turn my head, it moves closer to the door. So it's an example of how fictive motion works for lateral motion of the line as well. And you could say all these things like I looked away from the pillar, past the painting, onto the tapestry, and so forth. There's all these very, English is really great at this stuff. And then you can also combine lateral motion with axial motion. So for example, if this is a well, you could say I slowly look down into the well. Well, the down part is the lateral motion. It's lateral to the line. I slowly look down. Into is the axial part, into the well. So you can combine the two, one after the other. Okay, then a fifth kind of emanation type is communication paths. And this is the old conduit metaphor which has been made a good deal of in the tradition of metaphor analysis. But it really acts very much like yet another type of emanation path. So in this case, just as with sensory paths, there was an experiencer and an experienced. In communication paths, there's a message that moves instead of a probe. It's a message, and there's an informer and an informee. So those are the three basic elements. Again, I just named. There's still the three basic elements of a emanation path: the source, the distal object, and the thing that's moving, emanating from it. So examples are: I shouted the news down into the mine shaft to the workers below. So here's a mine shaft, and here I am standing, bending over, cupping my mouth and shouting news. And it's the prepositions are: I shouted the news down into, or way down into the mine shaft to the miners below. I'm in the informer, they're the informee, this is the message. And there's lots of sentences like that. She whispered the answer to him, or she whispered the answer into his ear. He smiled his assent to them, and so forth. There's all this very rich system in English for this kind of communication path. The message has to be a intellective, conceptual thing. It can't be a sensory stimulus, because you could say he told the news to her and she heard the news from him. Those are fine sentences, but you can't say he told a sneeze to her and she heard a sneeze from him. Those are incorrect sentences in English. Sneeze is just a sensory pickup entity. And you can't use a phrase like, she heard a sneeze from him. It's not loud. And so to hear something from is key to this communicative path idea. In addition, there are sentences that are that permit one or another of these entities not to be sentient. So you can have the informer doesn't have to be intentional or even sentient. So you can say things like the condition of the bark of a tree told me, informed me of the kind of beetle that attacked it. So you have a communication path coming from a source, but it's not a agentively generated source. And finally, again, the direction is fixed. It's got to be only from the informer to the informee in terms of fictive motion. So you can say, he imparted the news to me, but you cannot say, I interpreted the news into him. Something like that. Like he's telling it to me, the message is coming to me, but you can't. Just like in sensory paths, you're going to have a probe and a stimulus that complement each other, but there's no interpretational capsule that I can send into him, in English, at least. So the communication path is always in one direction. So this is like a finer analysis that fits all the conduit metaphor stuff into this fictive motion matrix framework, and in particular, it sets it up as one of the emanation path types. Okay, so we've gone through 5 subtypes of emanation path, and it's time to see what's in common about it, what we can say abstractive about it that's more theoretical. And this is where I propose what I call a principle that governs what direction something is, the fictive motion is going to take place in. I call it the active determinative principle. And if of the 2 objects, if one of them is more active or more determinative than the other one, that will be treated as the source. So the sun is brighter than my hand, so that's treated as more active, so it's treated as the source of the emanation. So the light comes from the sun to my hand. It's not that the sun sucks energy out of my hand. Similarly, with the looking, the agentive part of looking is more determinative. The agency involved in looking is more determinative than, say, I looked at, I don't know what, the garbage can. Is more active than the garbage can. So it's therefore by the active determinative principle, the agency one, whichever of the 2 objects is more active, because it's an agent, is going to be the source, and sure enough, that's what happens. With looking, unlike seeing, the source has to come from the looker. Now, what about the shadow paths? Well, the pole is determinative over the shadow. You can pick up the pole and move it, and the shadow will move along with it. You can't pick up the shadow and get the pole to move. So the pole is determinative over the shadow-pole complex. Similarly, if it's pitch dark or diffuse light, the shadow will disappear. Well, no, if it's diffuse light, the shadow will disappear, but the pole will still be there. So it's the more determinative of the 2. And that's why it's accorded it's treated as the source. The issue with how come it then goes in both directions with non-agentive sensory paths, like seeing and showing and so forth. The answer must be that both sending a probe and sending a stimulus for a non-agentive experiencer to emit a probe, and for an experienced object to emit a stimulus, are presumably, by this logic, experienced as equally active, equally dynamic, or equally undynamic. So neither of them wins over the other, and so therefore you're allowed to have fictive motion going in both directions. So the next question is, well, okay, if there's an active determinative principle, what determined it? What made it be that the more active determinative object should be the source? And I suspect that may come from a developmental phenomenon. In developing, who knows how early, it probably happens in fetal state, the individual starts sensing an experience of their own personal agency, the experience of agency. Any kind of volitional movement, like moving your muscle or something, kicking your leg, is volitional. So, and typically there's this kind of, if you want to affect something distal away from you, you can only, there's an distal pattern. The desire, the intention to affect the distal object, I mean, it could be anything. It could be a baby's rattle hanging in a crib, or it could be anything. If you want to affect it, the desire to affect it first starts in you, where you are. And then it somehow has to get from where you are to it. Either you move your whole body to where it is to affect it, or you reach out with your hand or foot or something to affect it, or you throw something towards it, or extend something else, an intermediary object, to affect it. But in any case, it always goes from the agent, which is determinative and active, with this experience of self-agency. The determinative active is determinative only if the agent decides to do something, does it happen? So it's determinative, it's more active, and it always initiates a pattern that starts from the agent, moves out to where the distal object is. So that agent distal object pattern may be the source, the origin of the more active and determinative thing acting as source, which then gets mapped onto all these other things. So, okay, so that's a possibility for why it happens. And then we see in this, we can start looking, just a quick look around for parallels between this linguistic fictive emanation pattern to other cognitive systems. And it looks like we have parallels. Much as in this model I mentioned of the overlapping systems model, there are all these parallels. So for example, let's look at what I call folk iconography, the various kinds of graphic formations that are part of folk art. So, for example, in cartoon books, comic books, Superman has X-ray eyes. Well, but how do the X-ray eyes, which direction do the X-rays move? They also move from the eyes out onto the object seen. You might have thought that they would come the other direction because if you in fact get X-rays, like your mouth, it comes from there towards you. No, but no. The imaging is built on what language has as the determinative, the agentive looking pattern, which is looking is always from the experiencer. So Superman sends out its X-ray vision. Similarly, with demonstrative paths is probably the model for magic coming from the fingers. You often see sorcerer movies or some of the movies with magic where sorcerers are dueling with each other and laser beams come out of their fingertips and zap. Well, that's a pure reification of something built into language, namely the demonstrative paths, like the arrow pointing towards the tent. So anthropology has a lot of, anthropology has discovered a lot of similar phenomena in various cultural traditions. So Pascal Boyer is a French anthropologist who wrote a book on ghost physics. He studied the patterns of systems of spirits and ghosts in many different cultures, and he noticed that the ghosts have many similar properties to real physical objects. They obey all the laws of physical objects with only a couple of exceptions. The exceptions are, one, is they're invisible, and two, they pass through solid objects like walls. Except for those, they seem to behave like normal objects. For example, they only have forward causality. They don't have backward causality. You don't get any folk spirits changing things earlier in time. You have to wait for modern science fiction to get that kind of notion. Well, but he had no explanation for why these particular exceptions, namely invisibility and passing through solid objects. Well, but all you have to do is look at demonstrative paths. That's what they are. If an arrow points, what emanates from it is invisible, and it passes through solid objects. In fact, if you ask me to point to where downtown Beijing is, I might point like that. Well, I don't point, like out the door and through the chamber and up the stairs and around, out the front door and over there. Instead, I just go straight. Well, because we all have this conceptualization that what emanates from the fingers is invisible and passes through solid objects. So it's already there. It's built into language. It overlaps with perhaps with visual perception. Certainly, and it seems to coincide as well with anthropological kinds of notions, like of ghosts. It also corresponds to notions of evil eye. Evil eye also comes from notions of evil eye, of somebody who follows the line of sight. And also, it's quite universal. I work, as you may know, with American Indian languages, and there's this American Indian story of Fire Boy, who's the son of the sun, who, wherever he looked, caught on fire. Well, he looks at it and catches on fire. So it's quite extensive, and I suspect all these concepts of power emanation and mana, heaven, I mean, not the notion of mana, power emanation, life force, all of it emanating from some object with power, extending out and impinging on things, is the same emanation concept. So it's a fundamental cognitive fluidity that shows up in many different domains. Okay, so that's one kind of fictive category, fictive motion category, the emanation paths. Well, there's another one. The second one is pattern paths. In pattern paths, something does move, something has to move, but the thing that moves is not what yields the fictive emanation. For example, let's say you can say a sentence like, as I painted the ceiling, drops of paint slowly spread across the floor. Well, here I am painting the ceiling. A drop of paint falls vertically to the floor. So the real motion, the factive motion, is this vertical downward motion of the paint spot. Then another drop falls vertically and forms another spot. And then the third one. Well, that's the real motion. But the fictive motion is this line of spots is seen as progressing forward across the room. And to do this, you have to draw like an envelope around the spots on the ground or a line through them so that each new spot that occurs is seen as the front of this extending and including it. So that the whole thing is like this kind of fictive worm or whatever line is fictively moving across the room. Well, that's what I call a pattern path. And it depends on something actually moving in the situation. In the first type of emanation paths, nothing was moving. So you needed a theory, you needed a principle, like the active determinative principle, to account for what the fictive motion direction was going to be. Here, however, you don't need a principle, because it's the thing in a total situation that is moving, which determines the fictive path, what is the direction of the fictive motion. Okay, so that's pattern paths. So next is frame relative motion. And in frame relative motion, you've got, there are two setups. One is where you have an observer and an observed, and which move relative to each other. And you can say that the global frame is, I'm going to call the factive frame. So, in the first case, I'm going to say that globally, the observer is moving and the observed is stationary. So I'm moving along. Well, you can, first of all, represent something as in the global factive way. So you could say, as I sat in the car, I looked at, I sat in the car and rushed through the scenery. Oh, and I looked at the scenery we were passing through. Okay, here is, I'm sitting in the car. The scenery, we're passing through the scenery. That's the phrase. So it's factive. But all of a sudden, you can reframe it so that, and in reframing, this is how I do it. So it's like, how did I set this up? Here's the, let's see. Here's the car, and the car is moving, and here's a palm tree showing scenery, and in the factive situation, the car is moving past the palm tree. But that's the global situation. But you can take the local situation, so just the car, which then sort of gets its own frame of reference to it, which excludes the motion, that this arrow excludes the arrow that went with the car's motion, and now the scenery acquires a motion. That's the reframing, so from the global to the local observer. And now you can say things like, as I drove along and watched the scenery rush past me, So now the scenery is rushing. In terms of this local frame, to him, sitting there in his car, the scenery is rushing past. And furthermore, the changeover is so thorough that you can use English words like watch. In English, watch, you only use the word watch if what you're watching is moving. You can watch a TV, but you can't watch a painting in a museum. You can only see a painting. You can look at the painting, but you can't watch it. But you can watch a TV. Here, we can say, I watched the scenery rush past. So thoroughgoing is the shift to the other framing, to the local framing. So, and furthermore, you can express sentences that show the reframing from global to local in the middle of the sentence. So you can say, I was walking through the woods, so here I am moving, I'm depicted as moving, so it's global framing, factive. I was walking through the woods, and this branch that was sticking out, hit me. Well, here's a tree with a branch sticking out, and I go like that, and I then switch and say, the branch hit me. Well, I hit the branch. But you can suddenly switch from the global to the local frame and have me that suddenly experiences stationary, so it's the branch that's hitting me. What you cannot, however, is you cannot partially allocate fictivity to each of the two objects. Make a partial global, partial local. So you cannot say in English, we and the scenery rushed past each other. That's totally ludicrous. On the other hand, it's not barred from factive motion. If you're on a road and there are logging trucks, you can say, my car and the logging truck rushed past each other. That's perfectly okay. You can't say it, though, about me and the scenery. So it looks like for setting up a framing. So here's a case which is exactly this situation which is impossible in English, where both are half indicated as is the moving object. So, okay. So then the next question for this is, all these examples that I've just given here are where the observer is factively moving, and the observed is factively stationary. Now what about the case where the reverse, where the observer is in fact stationary and the observed is moving? So you can say things like, the stream flows past my house. Okay. So the observer is, I'm in the house, I'm stationary and the stream is flowing. Now you cannot say anything fictive. You can't suddenly reframe. You cannot say, my house moves alongside the stream. Yeah, my house advances alongside the stream. That's impossible. Similarly, if I'm in a stream, you could say I'm going to try for one of these split sentences where you change in the middle. I sat in the stream and watched, or as I sat in the stream, the waters flowed past me. Fine. I'm the stationary observer. The observed is moving. You cannot now switch to the other reframing in the middle of the sentence. As I sat in the stream, rushed through its water. So you cannot say, I sat in the stream and rushed through its water. So you're not allowed to reframe in this case. So one question is, how come? So here's the mystery. How come you can go from a moving observer to a stationary one, but not from a stationary observer to a moving one? And the answer may be that, in this case, stationariness is basic for the observer. So that it's, if your observer is in fact moving, you're allowed to ratchet down to what's considered the basic state, namely stationariness. That is okay. But if the observer is already in what is treated as his basic state, you're not allowed to ratchet up out of the basic state to something that's not basic. Well, if that's the explanation, the next question is, well, how come stationariness is basic for the observer? And one proposal is that when in the first number of months of a baby's life, it is stationary. I mean, to itself, it is relatively stationary. It can be carried along. Let's say you walk along with the child, even facing forward. It gets the experience of translational optic flow as it is walked along, but it has no sense of its own motion. As far as it knows, it's in the center of the universe, and the universe is moving past it. Only months later, when the child can start crawling and can agentively determine its own crawling, and therefore start correlating in terms of its cognitive connections, its own intention to direct its limbs to move along, and thereby cause translational optic flow, does it get the idea that its motion can cause a translational optic flow. So for the first months of our lives, we're kings sitting on our thrones, watching the world do its thing. So it may be that stationariness is basic for the observer for developmental reasons. And if so, there's a kind of test which seems to work. If there's one other situation where there's two more situations. One of them should work like this translational optic flow. And that is, if you take an infant and spin around with the infant, so this infant sees the whole world spinning around and everything. But the infant itself, as far as it knows, it's not spinning. It's just the center of its universe. It has not agentively directed itself to do that. That, therefore, ought to work like, in terms of language, translational optic flow. But there is one circumstance where the infant does have agentive volitional control over motion, and that is it's moving its eyes back and forth and its head. So over short arcs, which cause therefore short arcs, it should have the experience of integrating its own intentional motions with what happens visually, the short arc transverse optic flow, which should therefore behave linguistically different from the way these first two behave. And it seems to be the case. I mean, so for example, I've already given a case where you can ratchet down to stationariness as basic for the transverse optic, for the this straight line optic flow. And you could probably do the same for continuous revolution. So I was on the merry-go-round and watched the world, and the world when it spun around me. Or we were in our rocket ship as our space shuttle turned and watched the heavens spin around us. Well, that's working just like the scenery rushing past us. So it works just the same, and it doesn't sound terribly poetic. It just sounds pretty standard English. But if you now talk about short arc stuff, I turned my head quickly, and as I quickly turned my head, I looked over all the room's decorations. What you are not going to say in English, as I quickly turned my head, the decorations of the room sped past my eyes, or something like that. That's already weird, poetic, something. It's not natural. Whereas in the other two cases, it's relatively natural. Well, it's an idea. Perhaps it's a thin reed to hang on, but it's an idea that maybe works out that something as subtle as where an infant has volitional control over its own optic flow. Where an infant has volitional control over optic flow, that's where in adult language you're not going to have an easy way to treat the observer as stationary, if it's in fact not. So, so that's that one. Then the next kind of another fictive category. Oh yeah, the motion after effect, which you see if a person is spun around and then they're stopped, they often see the surroundings as sort of moving past them while they're, or as if they were still moving or something like that. That seems to be a parallel to this frame relative motion. In frame relative motion, the question is which frame is moving. It's the same effect that you have with a train. Side by side train, one train starts, and you're not sure if you're moving or if it's moving. The whole question of how you perceive two frames that are moving past each other, one moving, the other not moving, and that shows up linguistically. So that was the perceptual parallel. The next category is the advent paths. So this is a kind of fictive motion where the static location or position of some object is determined by, it is represented by some sentence indicating a path that that object might have taken to get to that position, even if it's impossible that the object could never have taken that path. And an example are, to take active verbs, the palm trees clustered around the oasis. Okay. Oops, I left it here. So here's an oasis. Here are some palm trees. They're clustered around. But clearly, they did not move to this static clustering from some other position. Whereas you do have a factive sentence with cluster, as in the children quickly clustered together around the ice cream truck. So here's the ice cream truck moves along, and then children quickly clustered together around it. Well, that's the original meaning of the word, and it's factive used here. Here it's fictively used. You're referring to the locations of the palm trees as in terms of some fictive path that they might have taken to arrive at that location. This is what I call an advent path. It's the path that the objects themselves might have, are depicted as having taken to get to their current positions, and it's one way of describing the static configuration that they're now occupying. Well, or the beam slants away from the wall at a 45-degree angle. Well, so here's the wall, here's the beam, and it may be at a 45-degree angle. And it's phrased fictively as if it tilts away from the wall at a 45-degree angle. Well, it may be that that being never moved this way at all. It just was originally just put there like that. So again, we're talking about its position in terms of a path that it might have taken, a fictive path that it could have taken, based on the active use of this verb, like the rusted beam slowly tilted away from the wall. That's a factive use of it. But here it needn't have been. So it's again, it's an advent path. And there are passive verbs with that. So like, say the termite mounds on the desert, so here are these termite mounds on the savanna, are strewn over the savanna, distributed over the savanna, scattered over the savanna, even though they've never moved out of their position. They've always just been where they're located. And it's based on the factive use of words like, you know, the gopher traps were distributed, were strewn, were whatever, distributed by the trapper. So, okay. So that's an example of advent paths. And then there's access paths. By the way, for this presentation, I'm just presenting these as kind of like a series of unrelated things, but in the larger work, there are a number of factors that come and go, that are present in each of these, in any given category of fictive motion. Things like, is the observer factive or fictive? Does the observer move or is it stationary? There's a matrix of components that come into play in different fictive categories. And each one of these represents a particular configuration of these underlying components. But for some reason, I haven't included all that in this presentation. So right now, I'm just presenting these as kind of like a list. But the next in the list, then, is access paths, which is where the given represented object, which is located, is represented in terms of something else other than itself, moving in a way that it reaches and it moves into encounter with that object, and then as a way of determining what its location is. So one example is, let's say here's a street, here's a bank, and here's a bakery. And say I'm talking to you over here, and you ask, where's the bakery? And you can't stand up there. And I can say, it's across the street from the bank. The idea is that you use the bank as a reference point, and you say, it's as if you were to conceptually move from the bank, move your focus of attention or something from the bank across the street to the bakery. The bakery is across the street from the bank. And it's a fictive access path. It's a way of something else, like your focus of attention moving to the object of interest. And it certainly doesn't have to represent any physical motion. You're very unlikely to first cross the street, go to the bank, and then cross the street. You're probably going to stay on the same side of the street to reach the bakery. So it's not used to represent an actual path you should follow. It's used to represent a path that you could find the object through thinking about it, through the motion of some conceptualization, focus of attention, focus of thought. So what's moving is typically either a focus of attention or a whole body or a body part or something like that. So an example of a body part is the example I gave before. The vacuum cleaner is down around behind the clothes hamper. Well, for that, it depicts a path that your arm might follow down around behind the clothes hamper to get to the vacuum cleaner. So that's another kind of fictive motion, advent path. And then you can say like the balloon is 1,000 feet up from the ground. Again, your focus of attention seems to move from the ground 1,000 feet. And then factively, you might have a factive counterpart. The balloon rose 1,000 feet up from the ground. That's the factive thing. Okay, and then finally, the one that it has been recognized before, which is the coextension paths. And so for coextension paths, that's where something is depicted as the form or location or orientation of an object is presented in terms of something moving over its extent. So that's what I call a coextension path. And the fence is, of course, an example of that. So here's the plateau, and here's the valley, here's the fence, which is stationary. So the fence goes from the plateau down into the valley. So it's as if something were moving, your focus of attention, motion itself, who knows what, is moving along the fence to show it. It's important to have examples like the following. Like here's a granary, a silo, and here's grain fields, wheat fields. You can say the wheat fields extend out in all directions from the silo. It's another example of fictive motion, of a coextension path. Here you're representing a planar surface with motion that's radial by saying the fields extend out in all directions from. It's all fictive, nothing big, of course. And a factive counterpart would be the oil spread out in all directions from where it's spilled. That's a factive counterpart. And the reason this kind of thing is important is because it shows that fictive motion is not just a case of where some focus of attention is moving, as it is in this case. Because here there's no focus of attention that's possible. It's the whole of something is moving out in an expanding circumference. So whatever theories we have about how this parallels perception should be, it can't settle on a notion of it paralleling focal points. Let's see, I realize now that I skipped some of the perceptual counterparts, and let me just do a couple of them. With advent paths, where an object's shape and location are described in terms of itself moving to that location, there are counterparts in perceptual psychology, in fact, 3 in this case. For example, Alexander Pentland has a concept of if you see a doll, it's as if you perceive the torso with the head and the arm and the limbs moving to it, onto it. So it's as if in perceiving a doll, part of your very perception is of things moving onto it. So that would be an example of an advent path. Michael Layton has the contrary theory, which is that if you see any kind of non-regular shape, the way you perceive it is as if it came from an originally regular shape, which was then subjected to various protrusions and indentations that gave rise to this complex shape. And then there's the old Gestalt notion with the original Pac-Man thing, which is where you see Pac-Man as if some wedge were removed from a whole circle. Again, it's a kind of advent path where its current shape is perceived in terms of itself moving to and from, in this case to and from, or parts of itself moving to and from where it is. So these are all perceptual counterparts to the advent path kind of thing in spoken language. There may be some further, like I think I skipped some of the, so for example, with pattern tags, where you had, paint drops moving along. Well, probably the Marquis effect would be that. Let's say you have a row of light bulbs, and one of them, factively, this one lights up and goes off, this one lights up and goes off, this one does. So there's no factive motion, it's just a factive set of changes. But fictively, you could see a light jumping from one to the other to the other. And that might be an example of a pattern path in visual perception. Similarly, perhaps a parallel with co-extension paths. I mean, this is now an idea of mine. I think psychology should check it out. If you see a plus sign, you could perceive it factively as if it were steadily present. But you might perceive it fictively in terms of a succession of strokes. You first went like that, and then like that, as if you perceived or sense that you'd see, in my terms, you'd see at the palpable level, the static plus, and you'd sense a succession of strokes that follow its extents, much as in the manner of co-extension paths. Okay, so I'm going to skip all of Ception, but I think I'll tell you a little bit what I mean by it. It's a little too tricky to go over verbally, but I'll just give you an idea of what I mean by Ception. I think we may need a concept of Ception, which includes and extends so as to cover both perception and conception as a single unified continuum within cognitive processing. And there are several reasons for this. One is that psychologists themselves are not agreed on where to draw a principled line between perception and conception. For example, if you look at a certain object and then you first perceive it as a knife, as an identity, in ascribing the label, the identity of knife to it, have you left perception and entered conception or not? Well, psychologists differ on this. Some say yes, some say no. And if you suddenly associate it with sharpness and either a tool use or a weapon use, are you still perceiving it or are you now conceiving it? Again, psychologists will differ. Some will, in fact, say your thoughts about it as a sharp weapon are still part of your perception of it. So there's no principled way to draw the line between perceiving and conceiving. Similarly, or further, there are some processes, it seems, which in fact don't properly belong to just perception or to conception, but in fact extend across a continuum comprised of the two of them. And those get lost if you insist on a break between perception and conception. You can't allude to these other factors that seem to run across the combination of the two. So as soon as you set up a notion of Ception, which combines the two, you can have everything. You can have the way in which perception gradually, you don't throw out the distinction between perception and conception. You have a way of representing how one can graduate into another. You have a means for representing those factors which in fact span the whole line, the length of the continuum, and it would be misrepresented if you broke it up artificially, and so forth. And I give 13 parameters which seem to benefit from a notion of Ception, which run along an unbroken continuum from them. All the way from, and for me, the guiding one, the determining one is the palpability one. At the one end, you have the most palpable, and the other end you have the most abstract, the most concrete to the most abstract. That's the main one. And there's a number of phenomena that seem to cluster with take all 13 parameters, and they tend to cluster along one end of all 13 or at the other end of all 13. So that's the way I'm setting it up, and it's a way of treating visual perception as having a concrete end, which I was calling seeing, similar to factivity, and what I call a semi-abstract end of sensing, which I consider similar to fictivity. And anyway, it's all written up in the chapter 2, and you can read it there if you like it. Oh, by the way, I'll once again say that everything I've ever written is available for free on my website. Just Google me, and that's the easiest way to get to my website. And all my books and my papers and everything are all there. So this is chapter 2 of the fictive motion chapter. It's the fictive motion chapter, which is chapter 2. And anyway, that's what Ception is about. But just to mention it here and go on. So now with metaphor, in the way metaphors are set up, they're set up with phrases like love is a journey. But the way that those phrases are set up, they should really be set up as two phrases, one of them factive and one of them fictive. They really should be set up as saying, love is not a journey. That's the factive case, which one part of our cognition knows. The other part should be set up as love is a journey. That's the fictive part, which another part of our cognition has. But it turns out that a third part of our cognition knows that one of those is factive, the not one, and one of them is fictive, the positive one. And it's only because of this setup that we would call it a metaphor at all. If you didn't know that there is a factive variant of this, namely, love is not a journey, if you did not know that, you would not call love is a journey a metaphor. You just call it a fact. The only reason you can call it a metaphor is if some part of your cognition is aware of the fact that it's not a journey. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a metaphor. So a metaphor as constructed by the source domain and target domain notion has to be understood in terms of this this factive-fictive kind of situation, and this analysis of what's going on in your cognition in a fictive situation of three parts of your cognition: the assessor, and that assesses one representation as factive, the other representation is fictive. In addition, ultimately, metaphor theory could be extended to cover the kinds of things that fictivity is covering now. But it would do so with a bit of terminological difficulty. Because fictivity is set up so that the terminology readily covers both linguistics and perception. But it's hard to do that with metaphors. So, for example, let's take the notion of closure, which is a Gestalt perceptual phenomenon. Let's say you see a circle with a gap in it, and then you see, so that's what you see concretely, and you sense something closing it. Well, metaphor theory would have to say that you perceive a metaphor. Closure is a metaphor. And in particular, it's a metaphor from a source domain of continuity that's being mapped down to a target domain of discontinuity, of a gap. Well, that might rub psychologists the wrong way. It doesn't sound right. Whereas fictive terminology is also to bridge to span the two systems. So you would simply say the gapped perception is factive and is seen. The one with the gap being closed, the closure is fictive and is sensed. And that's how you'd say it in fictive terminology. So that's the comparison between fictive and factive. I could end with a notion about the dynamism thing, but I think it's time to stop. So let me stop this.